Okay, I'm going to talk today about the absolute. The reason I'm talking about the absolute, this is a perennial problem in Zen for students, but within the last week or so, 2 students have told me in exactly the same words that they understood the absolute, but they didn't have, quote, a feel for it. I kind of doubt they understood it, but anyway. So one of the problems with the absolute is that we call it the absolute. Nobody knows what that means, Somehow that word doesn't communicate very well. So part of having a feel for it is actually understanding what we're talking about when we say absolute. At base, the absolute is an attempt to describe what the world is like. It's not some theory that old Buddhist guys wanted to impose on the world. It's a worldview which came out of their experience. It's their attempt to describe a particular aspect of reality. An analogy that I think it works pretty well is, classical physics contrast to what we now call particle physics or quantum physics. And these are 2 different ways of looking at the world. Classical physics attempted to describe the world in terms of the observable reality, how the various objects and forces interacted. And the reason quantum physics arose was because scientists began to look more deeply at reality, and they were no longer convinced that classical physics explained their actual observations. There were things that just didn't compute if you're applying these rules and laws of classical physics. So when they began to look at the world from this new point of view, the reality became much more fluid, much more complex for them, much less provable. What they learned was that things could be waves and particles at the same time, that they could no longer measure things with the precision that they had been able to in classical physics. Things were a little more squishy. And so what happened? Did they abandon classical physics? No. All the things they had observed and quantified, like volume and weight and the properties and behavior of matter, all this was still true. You don't design a trolley car or a computer using quantum physics. You've got to have some regular classical physics in there to make sure the forces and everything works. They didn't need quantum physics to predict how fast a falling object would go. They could do that with classical physics. But what they did need quantum physics for is to explain these observations they're making that could not be reconciled with classical physics. Because classical physics is explaining the macro world, the world that we can pretty much experience. But what they needed quantum physics for was to attempt to explain the micro world, the world which we don't see with the naked eye, we don't take in with the sense organs without help. So both of these ways of looking at physical reality are true, but what they're describing is different levels of looking. So this is a good analogy to what Buddhists do when they talk about the relative and the absolute. We have a dual way of looking at reality as well. We start with the relative and then we progress to the absolute. At first, all human beings see things from the classical physics point of view. We see a world of matter, we see a world of objects. We experience a world of forces and measurable time. That's what we think. So we can call this, the objective world. Actually, in Buddhism, it is called the objective world. That is one term that Buddhism uses. And we more often refer to it as the relative, but it is sometimes called the objective world. I'm sorry, I misspoke here. In Buddhism, this is often called the relative world. Now, the reason this is confusing, this relative world applying to the everyday world, is because in physics, the world of relativity would refer to quantum physics, not classical physics. So it can be a confusing term. Whatever we call this world, that seems to be made up of things, including living beings. This is a world we perceive through our senses, and this is what we call reality when we start out taking a look around us at the world. Not only is this how we see the world, but we make some assumptions about this world. What we assume about these objects that we perceive is that they're permanent, that they stay the same. I mean, clearly, in some ways, we know that objects perish. We know that decay causes some things to disappear. We know that living beings die and decay. But in the short run of our experience, as we live our day-to-day lives, we tend to act as though, and we make the assumption that the current matrix of our lives is fixed, that it's not changing, that it's permanently the way it is. We think we will not die. We think that that banana on the counter will still be there tomorrow to cut up on our cereal. And what we don't think about is, okay, what if we left it there for 6 months? I just used this banana as an example, but then this morning there was a lot of conversation about this piece of artwork that has a banana taped to the world. So that's one thing we assume about this world we're experiencing, is that it's permanent. The other thing we experience is that all these objects in the world are distinct, that they're separate from one another. So this is the reality that our senses present to us. That tree out front actually looks like it's separate from my car. But if I try to meld them into one, as the Absolute tells me they are, I got a bad accident on my hands. So, like classical physics, this ordinary view of reality is not entirely canceled when we go on to a deeper way of looking at reality. This ordinary everyday world, it remains true. You can't live your life thinking that everything is empty and nothing exists. You have a hard time getting through the day. But we tend to take this relative way of looking at the world as the only way to look at reality. Unless, like physicists, we begin to make some kind of observation or have some kind of experiences, which this way of experiencing the world does not explain. Like quantum physicists, however, for some of us, there does come a time when we can no longer reconcile this original way that we look at the world with what we're now experiencing. It just doesn't explain everything anymore. So this is the point at which Buddhists too look deeper at reality. And this reality that they are seeing is no longer so provable to the senses. Like quantum physicists, Buddhists see a world that is more abstract, less logical, more intuitive, more complex than we first thought. So that one of the things we need to give up to progress to this more advanced point of view in both physics and Buddhism are the rock bottom qualities that we have assumed all along are part of our world. So physicists had to give up the idea that everything is precisely measurable, that everything is one thing or another, either a wave or a particle. They had to give up the idea that they could count on a very understandable pattern and that they are the observer looking on. They had to admit that if they wanted to understand the world in depth, that classical physics was too narrow a view. They couldn't, it no longer explained everything, just didn't. And Buddhists have to give up their assumptions about reality too, that it's permanent, and that those permanent objects are separate from each other. We have to admit, if we want to understand our experience in depth, that these ways of seeing are too narrow. Again, it's not that these ways of looking at things are no longer true. It's just that they don't explain everything. They only go so far. As Buddhists, it's helpful to look at what kind of examination we need to make that could lead Buddha or us even to form a deeper view of the world. What is it that takes us there? What can cause us to move on from the relative material world of discrete objects to a view that has come to be called the absolute, a word that's and a view that's very confusing to many. I would say the absolute is probably the rock upon which most Buddhist practice crash. So, the absolute arises when the world is examined from the point of view of meditation. That's why we do Zazen. That's why we sit. There are many reasons why, but that's one of them. This world that we experience in meditation is not a world of objects of permanence or separation. It's often distinguished from this world by being called the subjective world. Another way of talking about the relative and the absolute is to call them the objective and subjective. This is even more confusing. Half the problem with Buddhists is the language, but anyway. So the relative world would be parallel to the objective world. Same thing, just a different name. And the absolute world is parallel to the subjective world. So the objective world is easy. It's the world of things and objects. The subjective world is harder. It doesn't mean exactly what we tend to mean when we use the word in ordinary language, subjectively. Usually when we call something subjective, it's like something that looks at things from a particular personal, internal point of view. And this is part of what it means in Buddhism. But what the word also conveys is that things are subject to each other, subjective world. It's the absolute point of view has that things are not separate, that they are interdependent. This is the subject to each other. Things are not separate, they are subject to each other. They are what the word Buddhism uses is interdependent. And we'll talk more about this later, but right now I'm going to go on with this train of thought. So if we examine reality from the point of view of meditation, as Buddha did, what do we see that's different from the material world that we begin with? Well, we see what Buddha saw. What did he see? We know what he saw because he told us. He laid it out in his first sermon. These truths were how he had come to see reality after his questioning, after all his meditation and his struggle and his self-deprivation. He had the Four Noble Truths. Now I'm going to have to hold this really close because the print is small. What did Buddha see? He saw that everything changes. This is another way of saying that this sense of permanence that we assume about our world is not true. Quite the opposite is true, says Buddha. He says everything is impermanent. The next step in this seeing is an important one. Buddha does not spell it out for us. It's kind of implied from his first insight about change. So here's the logic that you follow to get there. If everything changes, that's pretty easy to see, but it's what develops from there that can be hard to see. If everything changes, then nothing is exactly the same thing from moment to moment, right? This chair in the corner might seem to be the same chair from week to week. But we know that subtle changes are taking place in it. The wood is aging and drying out. The paint may be more scarred this week than it was last week. And by next year, it may be more wobbly than it is now. So things are changing, sometimes imperceptibly, but they are changing. You can recognize me as Pat this week and last week, but there may not be everything exactly the same. There's a lot that carries on and is the same so that you recognize the person. But it will never be exactly the same person that you're meeting. It's kind of that you can't stick your foot in the same stream twice. The cells in my body have changed from last week. I may have had a cold this week that I didn't have last week. I may have added a few pounds. I may be thinking about very different things that are preoccupying me this week than last week. My emotional state may be quite different. Maybe last week I was depressed, this week I'm happy. So, not the same. And this constant change is true of all things. Even big things that you think don't change, you know, like if you look at the sun in the sky, it looks like this huge heavenly body that may be very permanent and stay the same. But we know that's not true. There's constant activity. And we know that at some point, many years hence, the sun is going to burn out. So even things that do look kind of permanent are not permanent. What we get from this is this: if things are not always the same, they can be said to be impermanent objects, always in flux, never static. So this is not a theory. Things are not the same. So how do you get a feel for this, as people were asking? You get it through meditation. When you sit, the very thing you think that is wrong with your zazen, the fact that your mind and body and feelings are all over the place, this is one of the most important teachings of meditation. You get to experience every time you sit on a cushion that everything changes. Now you're thinking about your job. Then you're focusing on your aching knee. Then you're thinking about sitting and how you're not doing it right. Next you hear the car engine racing outside. Then you're thinking about what you want for lunch. Along comes a little twinge of anxiety, and so on and so on. This is how it goes. So this whole jumble of thoughts and feelings and bodily sensations that you experience when you sit teaches you in the most intimate way and experiential way that everything, including you, is always changing. So this teaching only happens if you pay attention to the reality of your experience, and that you face your sitting experience as it is. If all you can make out of this experience of zazen is that you're doing it wrong, then you don't learn about change. You don't learn a very basic, important lesson of the Buddhist worldview. That's not all that happens in sitting, what I've just described, but it is a large part of what happens. Once we learn that all of reality is changing, and we see that nothing is permanently the same thing, then we make another leap, a logical leap from there. So what we say then is, if nothing is the same, nothing stays the same, we can call that empty. We can say, another way of saying that is everything is empty. Okay, now here's the crucial point. What is it empty of? What are things empty of? Permanence. That's all, permanence. They're not permanent, so they're empty of permanence. So this big scary word, empty, has a precise meaning. And it's the logical outgrowth of the very first truth we discover when meditating, that everything changes. So emptiness, that other big rock against which Zen practice falters, along with the absolute, it's not some mystical blob. It's not a hard to achieve or understand state of mind. It's just how things are. Once we observe the most basic observable fact about our lives, that everything changes. So this one aspect of emptiness that we can extrapolate from our basic observations about change is this quality of interdependence, also sometimes called in Buddhism oneness or non-separation. How did Buddha get there to interdependence from his basic logic about change? How can we get there? One of the things that we can do to help our understanding here is to get a little curious. Buddha said everything's changing, but he didn't tell us why it's changing. Well, actually he did, but not in this Four Noble Truths. So why? Ask yourself, why does everything change? We could have this very static, frozen world, you know. The answer is that change comes through cause and effect. Everything exists because it was caused by something else. You know, there's a lot of talk and argument about the first cause, you know, in physics, you know. We don't know what the first cause of the universe is, right? We just know what happened after something was there, but we don't know what produced that first something. And the same is true in our present day lives. Everything exists in a long chain of cause and effect and of mutual influence, though we may not know what started it in the first place. So the truth that Buddhists extrapolate from this easily observable fact of change is that therefore nothing is separate. If everything goes by cause and effect, then it can't be separated from its cause, because it wouldn't exist without its cause. I would not exist without my parents. So I could be said to be one with my parents. It's pretty easy to see, right? I can separate myself from them. I can try anyway. And I may want to. Indeed, I may have separated myself from my parents emotionally and physically. I mean, at this point for me, my parents are both dead anyway. But you can't really separate yourself from them. You are them, literally. So if this Sangha would not exist without an ancient Indian teacher called Buddha, then we are one with ancient India. And we are one with all the teachers that came after Buddha. From time to time, we recite the lineage, which is this long list, which is why we don't recite it very often, this long list of Buddhist teachers, starting with actually before Shakyamuni Buddha, because there's this theoretical thing that there were like 7 past Buddhas before Buddha. It's like a mythical thing. There were no Buddhas before Buddha. And then it goes all the way down to our present teacher, Barry. And when I die, I'll be added to the list. I mean, I think Joko is on there as well. So it's this connection. It's this cause and effect. Not all the connections we depend on are so obvious as these examples. Sometimes, if we're only looking superficially, it seems that there is no connection whatsoever between things and people. And yet, always, if we look deeply, we see that the whole universe is like a giant kaleidoscope. If one little piece of glass shifts, then the whole pattern rearranges slightly. This is how our world is. This is the connection between all of us and everything. When one thing changes, everything else changes. This is another way to describe what we usually describe as Indra's web, this vast web of connections. This is not something people made up. This is very logical if you accept the premises. So everything is connected to everything else through cause and effect. This is what Buddhism calls karma, cause and effect. Not everything that goes around comes around. It's cause and effect. So another way of saying that everything is interdependent, is connected, is to say that everything is one. How could we get everything is one out of everything is connected? This way, if nothing can exist alone, because it has to have a cause and it continues to produce effects, then all things are sustained in some kind of balance by everything else. That balance may not be a good balance from our human point of view. I certainly wouldn't claim the universe is in good balance right now, but it is a kind of balance nonetheless. It helps you to think of the universe as this giant ecosystem, which it is. That is what it is. It's sometimes easy to see how an ecosystem is in a state of cause and effect. If we apply poison to our crops and it rains, that poison will run off and our streams and rivers and oceans will become dead and polluted. So that's a kind of easy thing to see, at least of late we've been able to see that. But sometimes it's very hard to see the causes and effects in an ecosystem. It took a very long time for the connection between greenhouse gases and climate change to be recognized. So in the same way, it's easy for us to see how we're one with our families, but it may be harder to see how we're one with the terrorist. So this is one way we can understand what is meant when we talk about the absolute. It describes the way that reality, if we look at it deeply, is ever-changing, is therefore empty of permanence, and is therefore caught in a pattern of interdependence or oneness. These are the logical steps. So I hope this will help you understand the absolute. And as for getting a feel for it, more next time.